Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to open this session on business taking stock. So we're going to talk about business initiatives on implementing the guiding principles. Is the microphone working? I hope. Okay, good. Since, as you noticed, we are a bit behind schedule, I'm going to skip all the introductory remarks that were planned. I'm also going to skip some of the formalities, except for one thing. Speaking time from the floor will be strictly limited to 2 minutes. Please do not read statements that you prepared. We are more than happy to receive them and put them on the website, but we would really like to engage with you here in a discussion. This is such a unique experience. You should sign up if you have a chance on the speakers list, because that will give us an idea of who or some of the people who are in the room. We will take the liberty to deviate from the speakers list when calling upon people, depending on the topics that we're talking about. So much about the formalities, and now let me introduce the speakers. First of all, my name is Christine Kaufmann. I'm a professor of law at the University of Zurich, and I'm heading the Human Rights Center at the university, and I'm also the head of the Business and Human Rights Unit in the Swiss Center of Expertise on Human Rights. Just a footnote, this is not a national human rights institution, plain and simply because Switzerland doesn't have one yet. So let me now turn to our speakers. And before I do that, I would like to do, and something I do not want to skip, and which I think has not been done so far this morning, I would like to thank the people from the Secretariat, and especially John Grova, for helping us in organizing this event. They've done a tremendous amount of work, and I would like to join me in a big round of applause for them. I'm now turning to the speakers. We have Dan Bross with us to my left. He's Microsoft's Senior Director of Corporate Citizenship and leads a team with citizenship responsibilities, focusing especially on strategic issues, on CSR reporting, stakeholder engagement, and strategic partnership management. He joined Microsoft in 1998. Dan has been trained as a political scientist. He has a broad background in public policy, government and public affairs, and also corporate reputation management. Apart, and I think this is quite unique for this panel, he not only has a corporate experience, but also 10 years of senior management and program development experience in the non-profit sector, both at local and national level. To my right is Christian Leitz from UBS. He is the head of the Corporate Responsibility Management, and at the same time, he serves as the secretary of the UBS Corporate Responsibility Committee. In his function, he coordinates UBS corporate responsibility reporting, and he has particular responsibilities in the area of NGO communications and analysis. You may have noticed that Christian knows a lot of people here in the room, and that tells you he does communicate a lot with NGOs. He has worked on a large range of topics, including, of course, human rights, but also climate change, water, as well as social developments in emerging markets. Prior to joining UBS, Christian also worked in a non-profit sector, but not an NGO, but universities in the UK and New Zealand. He has a background in history, and he taught history classes at these universities. Min Arni Lin, to my left again, is a research associate at the Center for Economic and Social Development within the Myanmar Development Resource Institute. MDRI is a think tank. It's not yet that well known. It supports key stakeholders in Burma, Myanmar, including the cabinet of the Myanmar government, and it advises on macroeconomic and regulatory reform. This center, ladies and gentlemen, is a very important driver of change towards the rule of law and social development in the country. And especially the Center for Economic and Social Development that our colleague Minsar Nilin is working for is involved in establishing a frame for human rights compatible foreign investment. I think a topic that could not be more timely for this forum. Austin Onuoha has a very long, distinct record of working for different human rights institutions, especially in his home country, Nigeria. He was executive secretary and head of conflict resolution at the now called Human Rights and Conflict Resolution Center in Nigeria, and he's the founder and director of the African Center for Corporate Responsibility. He's currently studying for a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution in the US, but that's not his only job, as you can imagine. I think everybody who knows Austin can barely imagine him sitting in a library just writing books and papers. Of course, he's very practically engaged. He's monitoring on behalf of shareholders Chevron's community engagement initiative in Nigeria for the African Center, and he is also doing several other projects while he is in the US. Let me turn to my right again. We have Alan Fine at the very far end. Alan Fine is a public affairs manager at AngloGold Ashanti, and his responsibilities include a variety of public matters. For instance, he has participated in the development and review of the mining charter in South Africa and also worked on its implementation within AngloGold Ashanti. He has participated in the development and implementation of a human rights framework at AngloGold Ashanti. He is a trained economist. He used to be a trade unionist, so I didn't promise too much. He also has a very career with various backgrounds, and then he worked as a journalist before joining AngloGold in 2002. Now, there is an interesting story to Alan's CV. When he went to the university in South Africa, he met one of our other panelists, Ored van Heren. Now, this isn't terribly exciting. Yes, they went together to the same university, but there's more to it. Both of them engaged in unionist and student movements against apartheid. Both of them were in prison. And as I was told this morning, Alan was released while Ored was still serving his term under rather dire conditions. After his release, Ored was forced into exile. He worked for the ILO and served later as the labor attaché in post-apartheid South Africa. He has been the president and, as you all know, CEO of the Fair Labor Association since its establishment in 1999. And ladies and gentlemen, I was very moved, and I think I'm not exaggerating when I say this panel marks a very special moment in the lives of Alan and Ored. They are meeting for the very first time since being sent to jail in South Africa, here at this forum. And with this, I would now like to turn to the first round among our panelists. We heard a lot this morning about how important it is that corporate projects to implement human rights are inclusive. We heard that from Alexandra very early this morning. We heard it again from John Ruggie. We heard it from Michael Posner on the podium. And I would like to start with Dan Bross from Microsoft. Microsoft has issued its global human rights statement in 2012, so it's brand new. And Microsoft is also a member of the Global Network Initiative that we also heard about from Michael Posner this morning. So I would be, and I think many others in the room would be very interested to learn from you, what were the incentives, what were the triggers for you to join these initiatives. Please, Dan.
Well, thank you, Christine. And let me say, to begin with, I'm humbled to be on this panel, particularly with the story you just told. I had no idea of the history of the two panelists, so I'm much more interested in hearing from them than I am listening to myself. I'm also humbled looking at the audience and knowing a number of you in the audience. I think there are many people who could be sitting up here in this chair and do a much better job than I will attempt to do. But it's an honor to be here and participate and to try to tell the Microsoft story. Our incentive, or our sort of trigger for developing a human rights statement really was sort of two purposes, or two things. One, we're a signatory to the UN Global Compact. And I don't know how a company could be a signatory to the UN Global Compact and not have a human rights statement. So that was sort of the first incentive. And then the second incentive, and you mentioned it, Christine, was our participation as a founding member of the Global Network Initiative. As Christine mentioned, I've been at Microsoft for 14 years. In a variety of public policy, government affairs, and now corporate social responsibility positions. And over those 14 years, I was struck by the large number of policies and practices and procedures that we have across the company that touch on the issue of human rights. But for years, we struggled with an organizing framework for those policies and practices. And I'm sitting here looking at Jeremy with the Global Network Initiative, and I recall having a number of internal discussions whenever the phrase human rights came up. People at Microsoft would substitute the phrase freedom of expression. And for a company like Microsoft, that makes sense. But also for a company like Microsoft, human rights is much more than just freedom of expression. So the issuance of the guiding principles were really the sort of call to action that I and others across Microsoft, I think, needed and served as an impetus for us to be able to bring together a large number of people across the company to look at the guiding principles and look at the policies and practices that we already had in place. So it really served as an organizing tool and an opportunity to bring together a set of policies and practices that needed to be brought together. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes, thank you very
I could
much.
go on.
No, that's fine for the moment. Thank you very much. And I have to come back to my skipped introduction because I completely forgot, and it was not on purpose, to mention that we have a working group member among us, Dr. Margaret Young. She's sitting right in front here. And I'm sorry, Margaret, and in skipping the formalities, I totally forgot. So I would then like to turn to Christian Leitz from UBS. UBS adopted a statement supporting human rights in 2006. And UBS then in 2011 launched an initiative together with Credit Suisse, the famous Thun group of banks. And many people I know in the room are quite curious to learn what this group is all about. We know it's about implementing the guiding principles. And we would really like to hear from you, how come that you had this idea to bring a group of banks together working on the guiding principles? Please, Christian.
I think the question that I get asked more often than, we don't know whether we're going to be famous yet, is how this is spelled and how it's pronounced. I think that's what people tend to be more curious about now. I mean, I'm joking. I'm here essentially not because of UBS, which is an interesting way of starting, but because of the Thun Group. I think there are quite a few banks that could sit, or bank representatives that could sit in my place. So this is not about our bank, although I will make a few comments. After all, I am, in part at least, part of communications, that fluffy side of corporations. And so I will talk briefly about the UBS and the human rights issue, and then quickly about, or in more detail, about the Thun Group. Now, for those of you who are from Switzerland, my first comment will be strange, because people will know that Thun is a small town in Switzerland. That's what it's named after. In fact, having looked back at it, the origins are quite simple. Thun has a conference center of our bank, and that's where we made first. So that's the simple explanation. I think the more ambitious one, and that's why I rather use the term ambitious than famous, the more ambitious one is, of course, we have a kind of a precedent, which we, in the first meeting, actually referred to or used as an interesting counterpart, and that's the Wolfsberg Group. Now, the Wolfsberg Group actually focused on, originally anti-money laundering, but in the meantime, broadened out to a lot of other topics, anti-corruption, and so on. Also, I have to add, a conference center of UBS, Wolfsberg. So, regardless of all the negative news that we tend to get as a bank, we have done a few good things, and those are two. So, in a sense, that's the other play that we made on the name. This is not an official name. Although it's nice to subsume ourselves underneath that, it's not an official name. It's still an informal group, but an informal group with a purpose. And the background is, of course, that those banks that are part of it, as Christina indicated, have all in some ways worked on the topic of human rights before. Some, but not all, have had statements in place, like us or like Credit Suisse, but others too. Some have not. Some, in fact, worked on this while they were part of the group. So the group became, in a sense, a kind of a sparring partner on discussing the human rights topic. So I think that's an important starting point. I think the other one is, and I'm a very ardent football player, so I always like the pass that others give me. And I think the pass that was given me, at least one, is the point about acting collectively. I think the starting point was really that we had exchanged views before we actually met in 2011. So there had been a dialogue among banks on environmental and social issues before that. And so I think just to maybe remove already one question that might come, this was not the result of the financial crisis. We did not sit down in 2011 with the idea, let's try and find some kind of reputation gain by sitting down and finding something on human rights. I have to say, and we're getting into an interesting discussion here, I don't think that most of those people that were or are dissatisfied with banks would have been appeased by one initiative on human rights, but the other one, it is something that started actually before the financial crisis, or discussions that we had around environmental and social topics. So there is a pre-existing dialogue between banks on topics of relevance to us before that. There are pre-existing activities at banks before we met within this forum. Of course, the statement issue, but I think there are more important ones going into the processes at the firms. For instance, when I look at our own, the human rights topic, it appears quite explicitly in our code of conduct since the beginning of 2010. It is something that is explicit in our responsible supply chain management. It's explicit in, and that's, I think, very crucial for a bank, in the environmental and social risk management. I think, the other banks would agree that, with that kind of conclusion on them. So ultimately, we came together because we needed, and this relates to one comment John Ruggie has, I think, made repeatedly, and that is, of course, the financial sector, the banking sector was something that was least looked at through the whole process. Not actually looking at implementation, that's my last comment, but at translation. Because honestly, the guiding principles in the first step is not something that a bank can simply use to implement the topic of human rights into its activities.
Thank you very much. I think that was an appetizer, and I'm sure there will be more questions then, and we want to know a little bit more of what's going on with the Thun Group. Let me now turn to Alan Fine from AngloGold Ashanti. AngloGold is currently in the process of establishing operational systems to implement its human rights commitment, including, of course, the UN principles. So that reminds me of Christian's comment. Obviously, there is translation necessary. So I would be very interested, and I'm sure others in the room are too, what are the challenges and what are the industry-specific initiatives that you joined, like the voluntary principles, for example, helping you in this endeavor?
Okay, thanks, Christine. Let me try and do my best to answer those and maybe a couple of other questions. Okay, as a gold mining company, AngloGold Ashanti operates in some fairly challenging environments, and we do work that in itself is challenging from all sorts of sustainability and human rights perspectives. The company operates about 20 mines in 10 countries, the majority of those in the developing world. The company's followed the work of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General quite closely, especially since the advent of his 2008 reports. Now, the company's top leadership has always had a stated commitment to human rights, and ever since I can remember, has been reporting a commitment to the Bill of Human Rights and the ILO fundamental principles on rights at work. And in addition to this, the company has been associated with the Global Compact since 2004. It's part of the voluntary principles on security and human rights. It's part of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. A founder member of the International Council on Mining and Metals with its 10 sustainability principles, reporting according to GRI, and part of the Responsible Jewelry Council. So the question that arises with all of these links to all of these institutions and all of these commitments, why is it, many of us in the company wondered, is it that events have happened over time that have appeared to belie that commitment to human rights, and it's happened to the company more often than is comfortable. So when the know and show concept arose, it resonated a lot with the company and the idea of human rights, ongoing human rights due diligence. So the way we started is in about 2010, we conducted a fairly high-level gap analysis and, of course, found gaps starting with the absence of a human rights policy statement, even though we had elements of human rights policy statement in a large number of other policies related to mostly the other sustainability disciplines. So what we did is we brought in a human rights expert, one of these militant NGO types, who'd happened to also have advised and conducted research for the special representative. And she carried out a far more detailed gap analysis. In fact, I suspect she's probably the only person in the entire company that has read every single policy and framework and system, because nobody else does. They focus on their own particular areas. And that has, well, not only led to, it has gone together with development of a policy and a framework. The policy is due to be considered by the company's executive committee at its next meeting, having gone through a process of internal and external review. And just to spell out a few other things that the company, our human rights project, which is worked on by this expert and I, we've done a lot to socialize human rights through the company, starting with the establishment of what we called a human rights working group, which comprises not only all of the sustainability disciplines, but all of the process ones, including internal audit, risk, compliance, and the like, and representatives of each of our regions. We've also worked closely with Shift, and in fact we've brought in another one of these human rights experts from a similar background. We're carrying out reviews and pilots to assess further gaps, to test existing systems and work out methodologies of human rights due diligence. The key thing that we're doing is that we are trying to do it through integrating human rights into all of existing systems and policies and frameworks rather than creating a whole new one. And we think that about 70% of our human rights risks are already covered under the health, safety, human resources, security, environment, community disciplines. So you have to stop me there. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure we have time
Sure.
to come back on these issues. Ms. Arnie-Lynn, when you listen to
Microphone for the chair, please.
all the previous speakers, you're coming from a
Microphone for the chair, please.
human rights questions are very urgent right now, urgent issues. What would your wish be if you had a wish to these companies, a request? What would that be?
Yeah. Like Myanmar is famous for the, in the past, because Burma is famous because of the human rights violation. Also, we are in the same position with North Korea and Somalia for the many international index. But like the over a year's new government has initiated a lot of reform, a series of reform for the benefit of the country, including in the area of human rights. But we still need to. There's a big room we need to improve for the human rights for the people of Myanmar. Like our governments, also they established the National Human Rights Commission last year to take care of the human rights problem inside the country. So also, government have succeeded in engaging with them, a number of key stakeholders for the political reconciliation. And also, in the past, many people think, including me, thought that Myanmar Parliament is just a rubber stamp parliament. But nowadays, what I can see that our parliament is far away from rubber stamp parliament, although there are some viewpoint. Also, the government has initiated a series of economic reform for the benefit of people. Also, the president and some of the minister announces in the last few months, their government is very committed to adopt the EITI in Myanmar. Our center, MDR and CSC, also working very closely with the World Bank and EITI International Secretariat to implement EITI in Myanmar. Last month, while EITI mission was in Myanmar, I was also involved in the mission, and I've seen the response from the government is positive. Although the government has initiated a lot of reform, but sometimes I heard it from the ground is that some of the reform is not really benefit for the daily life of the people in Myanmar because of the level of the institutional capacity and technical capacity to carry out the policy, detailed policy to implement inside the Myanmar. Also, ongoing tension, the corruption also another challenges in Myanmar. Also, the lack of the respect to the local people, to the lack of the transparency for the investment projects also stay critical in Myanmar. Yeah. Also, I think I also would like to races. And also, because we are neighboring with China. So, also about over 80% of our foreign investment go to the extractive industry. That is why we thought that the EITI mechanism is also quite important for Myanmar. Also, two-thirds of our foreign investment was dominated by the neighboring country, especially China. So we also, I think, need to, for Burma as a small country, it's very hard to deal with the giants. So I think this is also very critical for Myanmar. Definitely for Myanmar, we need a responsible investment inside the country. But nowadays, the government is very willing to accept all of the suggestions from the international. That is why your suggestion, your input, your love is very important for Myanmar to move country forward for the benefit of entire population in Myanmar.
Thank you very much. If I understood you correctly, it seems that international initiatives such as ENTI are very important for your country at this stage. They are transparent, they are easier to understand than a variety of different corporate individual policies and programs. Austin, would you say you share that opinion? And before I give you the microphone and the word, I would just remind all the people in the room, please do sign up on the speakers list if you want to join into the discussion, because they have to close the speakers list in a few minutes. In fact, once Austin has finished. And once Oret has finished, sorry. Austin, please.
Okay, answering your question directly, my response to initiative like NEITI, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, has been, let's say I'm married, I have a wife, and I earn $2,000 a month, and then I tell her that this is what I earn, and I use the money to go drinking. I'm transparent, but what has happened? Because this is what is happening with Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. You get to know the signature bonuses that are paid. You get to know what the companies are doing. But you don't have the framework to hold your government accountable for what they do with the money. That's a very big issue. And many of us are aware of some of the budget issues we're having in my country. But specifically to the guiding principles, we started a project, we got some funding after, we participated in the consultations for about 6 years. And then coming from my background, I ran for student union election those days, and I lost the election because they felt I was not a Marxist. I grew up in Nigeria where it was thought that Marxism was the solution to every problem. So they said I wasn't a Marxist, and I didn't know what capitalism was. So I decided to find out what companies have been doing and how they've done it. So all my life, I've tried to look at where companies have done good, and that's what brought me to where I am today. So when the guiding principle came on board, I felt that this is an opportunity for companies to build relationships. But we needed to know to what extent this can be useful in my own context in Nigeria and some part of the West African sub-region where I work. And so we started a project, and we conducted the research. We interviewed about 264 people. Unfortunately, out of that 264, not one person, 1 year after the guiding principles were released, have heard about the guiding principles. And those we interviewed included academics, they included business executives, and they included civil society and community leaders. Now, but one interesting thing we also found out was the reluctance on companies on their side to talk about human rights. They would rather talk about challenges they face in their work or issues of community engagement or conflict. They don't want to use the word human rights, the phrase human rights. So we are worried about that. And again was that companies were very reluctant to grant interviews, but they were ready to share their stories and experiences in their personal capacity. So if we agree that for the guiding principles to make sense, to be implemented, to be advanced, there has to be senior management sign up, then something has to be done to get them to come on board to be part of it. We also notice that there are several mechanisms for dealing with the issues that the guiding principle is trying to deal with, especially in my country, Nigeria. So part of the problem we're having is how do you coordinate this so that you achieve that level of predictability that Professor Rogi talks about. If you have an issue, you know it's going to a company, you know by the nature of this issue, they're going to handle it within their own internal grievance mechanism, or they are going to outsource it to a professional mediator. And then within a specific period of time, this is the kind of response you'll get. Or if they're not going to deal with that kind of case, you know the criteria they use to dismiss it, say this is not within our purview. So these are some of the challenges we are facing, and I think I'll get back to you as we go on some of those issues.
Thank you very much. I now turn to Oret. I'm not sure whether Alan had Fair Labor Association in mind when he talked about the militant NGO type. I assume not, but you never know. Since you have worked with so many companies over the years, and you have this very clear mission statement that you have a clear standard, you then monitor the compliance with the standard, but you also support companies in implementing the standard. I would be very interested to hear your reaction to the panelists so far. Do you see things that are missing? Do you see parts that you think are excellent? What's your reaction?
Thank you, Christine. You know, the Fair Labor Association emerged out of a White House task force that President Clinton convened in 1996. And at the time, what he did was challenge the industry, the human rights NGOs, the trade unions, and the Department of Labor to come up with a system to address human rights abuses in global supply chains. And I think that having such a powerful convener and such a distinct challenge was a very, very important ingredient in our DNA. And what it did was it focused people's minds right from the beginning on implementation. How do you actually get this done in a very long, very complex, very diverse global supply chain? And most of the companies at the table were of the Nike, Levi's, Philips Van Heusen mold, who did not own or control their suppliers. So they were talking about a lengthy 35 or 40 country wide supply base that they didn't own or control. And in many of those facilities, they were only 5 or 10% of the annual turnover. So they had very limited leverage. So those challenges, if you like, of how do you get this stuff done in a nuts and bolts way when you've got other stakeholders sitting around the table with real expectations, were there right from the start. So the idea of performance requirements, of measuring, of accounting, and of stakeholder engagement in a transparent fashion were baked into the model right at the start. And I think it really helped having a convener like that to say, no one leaves the room until we sort this stuff out. So by the time we did leave the room, and it was, you know, a highly contested negotiation. I mean, people slammed the door, banged on the table, walked out, and not everybody made it to the end of the road. But the group that did, and ultimately it was a coalition of the willing, because clearly you couldn't get agreement on all of those points. But the coalition of the willing that did leave the room finally in 1999 were able to then, I think, demonstrate that a lot of this stuff is doable. And we weren't sure of that at the start. So how did we get it done? I think the key ingredient in all of this was that we created a safe space. We created a space in which companies, NGOs, trade unions, academics, universities could come together and confront a problem without any judgment, without any naming and shaming, without any birthright. Nobody had a birthright. Nobody had an entitlement to the truth in those meetings. We still don't. We go into those meetings knowing that we're all facing a governance gap, a particular challenge that none of us has the answer to. And there are no simple answers to it. And the more we peel the onion, the more we delve into those issues, the more complex we realize they are. And often in ways that are quite embarrassing to our positions. But what works is that we hung the position on the coat rack before we entered the door. Because if you come into that room with those positions, you're not going to get very far. So we've developed and refined that safe space concept over the last 12, 13 years in a way that has allowed us to embark on those discussions, on those negotiations in a way that is, let me say, open-minded. What the other secret ingredient there is that we've brought in the best technical expertise we can find on each one of those issues. And by making it a technical issue rather than an ideological or a political issue, we've also been able to come up with practical and doable approaches, which is very, very important. We're discussing a lot what would make a company commit to those issues. I can tell you that most of those issues, when we got into the room, I could see written on everybody's face, this is impossible. I cannot do this. I don't know how to do it, but at first glance or just in principle, this is actually not something my company can do. And then we get into it, and we start to discuss it, and we start to break it down into bite-sized chunks. And pretty soon people are saying, I could do that. Yeah, I could do that. And by the time we leave the room, we've actually got a roadmap of those bite-sized chunks, but those are the milestones. Everybody's made some compromises, everybody's made some adjustments, everybody's committed to doing what they can. But we leave the room with a real roadmap. We put actual numbers on those milestones. Everybody knows they're going to have to report on that progress. Nobody's abandoned their expectations. Nobody's left the room saying, you know, this is just a feel-good commitment that we've all made. It's real. We sign that as a contract. We re-sign a contract with our members every single year. Coming into the room is voluntary. Committing to those statements, committing to those objectives is not. We sign a 35-page contract with our members at the beginning of every single year. Those commitments are cast in stone. But getting there is going to take, it does take a lot of cooperation and a lot of exploration that we all agree to do in that safe space. So that's what I think has you know, there are a couple of things in what I've just been saying, but you put them together and I think you have something like the recipe for a successful and effective multi-stakeholder initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we turn to the floor, I would like to give the word to Margaret Young, a member of the working group. Please, Margaret. Do you have a microphone? So why don't you use... Yeah? Oh.
First, let me thank the speakers and Christine for facilitating and drawing together such an excellent panel. This is all part of a very large collective learning and reflection process in the human rights and business field. And the United Nations Working Group is very much a part of that. And as I sat and reflected on the different things I was hearing, there were 3 key points that for me came out of this that I wanted to actually throw out to some of the stakeholders in the audience to see if you can reflect back on those and help give the working group a few more answers in this space. The first one related to something that Alan said, and that is, he mentioned that you found in AngloGold Ashanti that 70% of it was already covered, but it was covered under different names. It was covered under health and safety and environment and risk and other names than human rights. Now, to me, that is a key message to get out to companies, because there are so many companies that are looking at this agenda and they're thinking, we've got to start from square one and we've got to build up all new human rights risk management systems and new human rights impact assessment systems, and this is going to be a huge task. And I think the better we can get about delivering that message that this isn't about starting from square one. This is first about looking to where you can piggyback human rights into your pre-existing systems and processes and policies in the company. Then I think we will make that job so much easier about getting new companies on board. So to help us reflect on this and to help the UN Working Group get that message out, I would like to hear if any other companies have that same kind of story. Can you put a number on it that 70%, 80% was already there? The second point I heard that triggered something that I wanted to throw out again to the audience was on the reflection of, or on the question of what prompted the company to get into this space in the first place. And Microsoft answered, well, it was when we signed up to the UN Global Compact and the GNI. But something must have prompted that. I mean, something must have come before that, whether it was a news story, whether it was something that happened in their peer group that Microsoft suddenly said, oh, we don't want to be in their position, whether it was an enlightened CEO, whether it was an investor that was requesting a piece of information about human rights that they just couldn't give. Something must have come before that. And we need to think about what these triggers are that bring companies already to that space, so that we can use those triggers on other companies, because there are 6,000, 8,000 who have signed up to the Global Compact and who have taken that question. But there are another 60,000 out there that we haven't got to that space yet. So we've got to get clever about what really drives companies to this space so that we can use those levers. And then the third was more reflections on Arit's point about how do we establish that safe space in the whole human rights and business field, that safe space for actually getting down to implementation, which is where this generation needs to be. Okay, thank you, Christine.
Thank you very much. Since you addressed Microsoft, may I just turn to Dan for that question to share his experience? Did you have an enlightened CEO? Or was it something else?
In fact, when you were speaking, I was going to interrupt, but that would have been outside of UN appropriate protocol, so I didn't. But I would have said all of the above. Actually, all of the factors you mentioned, plus others, contributed to us signing on to the UN Global Compact. I will say, at least in Microsoft's instance, and I think in every company's instance, it does take an internal champion or champions to lead that effort. As it relates to the UN Global Compact, I was involved in extensive dialogue and discussion with investors who were asking us, why aren't we signatories? And in reading the compact and talking to people internally, the answer was, well, we ask ourselves another question, well, why aren't we? We agree with all of this, why aren't we signatories? So it was a very easy decision to make that we should sign on once the issue was brought to our attention. Now, shame on us for us not proactively just stepping forward, but it was, in answer to your question, was really the conversations and engagement we had with socially responsible investors. In terms of the Global Network Initiative, it was clear there needed to be a cross-industry effort, initiative to address the issues that the ICT industry was facing and is facing. I'm pleased that Michael Posner mentioned the GNI. I'm glad there are 3 company members and 1 observer company member. There are a number of companies in this room who I wish would step up and join the GNI, because I think it is through initiatives like that that we will be able to continue to advance the cause and the issues related to human rights.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to relate to another comment, especially that you don't have to start from square one, but quite often in companies you will find out once you engage in the process that many of the principles are already implemented. And I would very much like to take the opportunity, since we have Christian Frutiger in the room. I can't see you. Where are you? over there. Christian Frutiger from Nestle, and since he worked very closely, Nestle worked very closely with Fair Labor Association on a project in Ivory Coast. I think that might be interesting to learn from your experience. Did you have to start from square one? And first of all, how come that you engaged in that process with the Fair Labor Association? What triggered it? Please.
Okay, many questions at the same time. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm another one of those people who moved over from the humanitarian and development sector and before an adolescence of a rather militant nature into the corporate sector. I wasn't in prison. I did visit prisons with the International Committee of the Red Cross for over a decade. So that's my prison experience. Was much in place? Yes, much was already in place, and a bit like Alan described, we started at Nestle with a gap analysis in 2008, 2009. I didn't call a militant NGO person. I actually called Margaret Jung from the Danish Institute, who is now on the working group on business and human rights, and this is when we started the human rights due diligence process with the Danish Institute for Human Rights. A fully fledged process in 8 steps, which really goes from the policies to the monitoring and reporting. It's on our website, so I'm not going to go through that. The one thing I wanted to point out is, and what also led us to working with the Fair Labor Association, is a very important step in that due diligence, which is the risk assessments. You have to look at your risks, and you have to look at your risks, of course, within your own operations, which is your priority, but then you have to look at your value chain, and very quickly you will probably see for many for many companies that some of your biggest risks are completely outside your comfort zone. There are an area somewhere upstream in the supply chain, like for us in part of the agricultural supply chain. We don't own farms. We source directly from about 700,000 farmers, but then we have like 5-6 million farmers from who we source indirectly, like in cocoa or hazelnuts, for example. In cocoa, where there are 12 intermediaries in between us and the farm. And there you have all kinds of issues ranging from child labor to other social issues. And what really led us to working with the FLA was that risk assessment, and we started first on hazelnuts in Turkey and then on cocoa, both in 2011, and became the first food and beverage company actually to join the FLA. So my question to the panel, I have 2 questions to the panel. One would be, well, how do you, in your companies, for the company representatives, assess risks and prioritize? And then the question is, the other question is maybe to Oret on the safe space. How feasible is such a safe space? Yet it is feasible within the FLA environment, but of course the moment you go out, look at the supply chain of a company, write a public report, you find gaps, which is evident. How do you then monitor or manage the dialogue with other stakeholders, some of whom may not agree to the safe space principle and rather go for campaigning?
Thank you very much, Christian. Now, you didn't address your question to a specific member of the panel, I understand, right?
On risks, no, that's a general question. On the safe space is more to Oret.
Yeah. So the risk question, Christian, how do you in UBS deal with risk and prioritize risk?
Actually, I can ask, maybe go into the safe space one first, so let's just not leave it to Oret alone. Because, I mean, of course, we created a safe space, but the safe space is, with one exception, limited to the banks. And I have to say that up to now, that's worked. Because I think we really needed to get into the subject matter and really get an in-depth understanding across the banks that are part of the group that we created before even considering widening it out. Now, having said that, of course, we all have long-standing experience, I would argue, with these topics, with that topic of human rights and with stakeholders that are involved in this topic. So, of course, we did use a lot of the material, a lot of the experience that we have gathered. But the safe space in our case is still limited at this point in time to, as I said, with one exception, the banks. So that's just on the safe space. And actually, I believe until now it works. Creating this discussion paper on how we deal, and this comes back to your question about risk. I mean, risk is a key element of banks, even if some people assume that it didn't quite work so well over the last few years. But banks are about risk management, and clearly, one important component that's grown substantially in many banks, or grown from literally not much to an integral part, is environmental and social, including human rights, risk management. So while it's not risk assessment in the first step, I use the term risk management, clearly part and parcel of it is the risk assessment. Now, just to add one final comment, and that relates to my other panelists, we really, when we look at what we've been working on within the Thun Group and the discussion paper that we've been creating across, and I have to add, these are all universal banks. So we're talking about retail, private clients, investment banking, and asset management, the whole set, that a universal bank can and often does cover. Then clearly, and due diligence being the key part of it, principles, 17 to 21 plus principle 16 of the guiding principles, then of course we come back, over and over again to the approach that our clients or potential clients take. So in a sense, for us, for me sitting here on the panel, the crucial information is, of course, the kind of information that Microsoft gives, or AngloGold, or that Nestle has just given, because ultimately we banks, depend on the activities in this space of the companies that we, in particular companies that we deal with, but also, of course, and this comes back to you, the international initiatives that we can relate to in the processes that we have either introduced or try to introduce or expand.
Thank you. I'm turning to Microsoft. You said human rights at the beginning were limited to freedom of expression. Now I can expand the question, were human rights considered as risks only? Or how did you conceptualize that framework, and how are you addressing the risks in your company?
We address risks on an ongoing basis, and I want to clarify, just so everyone is clear, because of the sector that we're in, the industry that we're in, the ability for technology to be used to advance human rights, I think, is demonstrated on an ongoing daily basis. Similarly, the ability of technology to be used to impinge on individual and collective human rights is also we're aware of on a daily basis. So when I talked about freedom of expression, I think it would be appropriate to look at freedom of expression for an ICT company as sort of number one risk and number one responsibility and number one opportunity because of the business that we're in. We are in the process of finalizing an assessment across Microsoft of our products and services through the lens of human rights and through the lens of risk and opportunity. When I was listening to other speakers, one of the things I regretted not mentioning earlier, and I'll mention now, for those of you sitting in the audience who work for companies, represent companies, and don't have a statement, let me assure you, developing the statement, I think, is the easiest part. I took great pride at the end of our last fiscal year in my performance review by saying that I had led the development of this human rights statement. And I was recognized for that work, which I was pleased to be. But that was the easy part. The more challenging part, but the part that brings more responsibility with it, I think, is implementing and living and infusing this human rights statement through our operations on a daily basis. And that is not necessarily always easy. I'm proud of the statement we have. I think it aligns with the guiding principles, but there are areas of ambiguity or lack of specific clarity. And we've been talking a lot about working with external stakeholders, which is a very important part of this process. But for those of you in the room who work for companies, working with your internal stakeholders is equally as important. And truth be known, I think the internal part of my job is the more difficult part of my job. Not because I work with difficult people, although some of them are, and not because I work in a company that doesn't get human rights or whose employees are not passionate about human rights, because they really are. I've been surprised by the support internally and the recognition and awareness that has come with our human rights statement. But because Microsoft is a highly diverse, highly matrixed organization where individual initiative and autonomy is rewarded and encouraged, bringing internal stakeholders together to look at our human rights statement through the lens of risk is difficult but very important work.